And just ask yourself, as you have discussion after discussion on the G20, ask yourself a simple question. Which G20 leader goes to a G20 meeting and says, hey, how do I save the world? Or is he thinking, how do I improve my ratings at home so I can get re-elected again? So the primary focus of each leader is on his own cabin. And that creates a structural problem. And the structural problem is that we need leaders to take care of the boat, but instead we have leaders who take care of the cabins. And if I may say something even more heretical here, we all know that democracy is obviously the best form of government, and there is no alternative to democracy. I acknowledge that. But let us be honest. Let us also admit that some democracies, including, sadly, the democracy of the most powerful country of the world, the United States of America, may have become dysfunctional at a time when we expect American leadership to take us through an economic crisis, a climate crisis. What is the other American leaders doing? Fighting each other at home. And just a few months ago, as you know, they brought the world to the edge of the cliff by arguing about the debt ceiling. And The Economist had a wonderful cartoon that showed the Tea Party leading the Republican Party by the nose, the Republican Party leading the United States by the nose, and the United States leading the world by the nose. And you could see how a small, special interest group could bring the world to such a dangerous point. And that's the tragedy, the difficulty we have of dysfunctional democracies. So as you analyze this situation, with the world becoming smaller and smaller, and the leaders becoming narrower and narrower focused on their work, you can understand why we feel pessimistic about what's happening in the world. That's the first historical juncture. And the second one, at the same time, as we have to handle this massive transformation of the world, we also have to handle the greatest power shift that we have ever seen in human history. And how do I characterize this power shift? Quite simply, with 2 points. We are seeing, on the one hand, the end of the era of Western domination of world history. But I hasten to add that the end of the era of Western domination of world history is not the end of the West. Indeed, I can tell you that the whole world wants the West to succeed and wants Europe to succeed, wants Europe to overcome this crisis, because we all live in the same boat. But at the same time, the capacity of the West to dominate the world in the way that it did is disappearing. And we are seeing, secondly, the return of Asia. And why do I call it the return of Asia and not the rise of Asia? Because from the year 1 to the year 1820, for 1800 out of the last 2,000 years, the two largest economies in the world have always been China and India. And it's only in the last 200 years that Europe took off and North America took off. But the last 200 years of world history, when you view it against the backdrop of the last 2,000 years, have been a major historical aberration. And all historical aberrations come to a natural end. And therefore, it will be absolutely futile for the 12% of the world's population who live in the West to try to control the destinies of the remaining 88% who live outside the West. Those days are gone. And if there was wisdom in the West, they would accept this change and say, how do we build a new world order together? Sadly, from time to time, we don't see enough wisdom. And if I may give an uncomfortable example, just this year, in 2011, you saw that when Mr. Dominic Strauss-Kahn had to step down, and I'm not discussing the reasons why he had to step down, it would have been a perfect moment to announce to the world, now is the time for a non-European to run the IMF. But guess what? That moment was lost. Another European took over the IMF. And I'm not questioning Ms. Lagarde's credentials. She's brilliant in her job. But the issue here is, how much longer can you maintain this rule that says that to become the head of the World Bank, you must be an American, to become the head of the IMF, you must be European, and 3.5 billion Asians don't qualify, even though they have the world's fastest growing economies, the world's largest pool of foreign reserves, and now the world's largest pool of economics PhDs. But no Asian is qualified to run the IMF or the World Bank. These are the sort of uncomfortable changes we have to address at this time. And then the third critical historical juncture that we are facing, which is something that is very difficult to describe because it is still very much a process that is unfolding as we speak. And how would I describe this historical juncture? I would say it's about the fact that we can no longer have strong leaders in this world. So the collapse of Mubarak, the collapse of Ben Ali, the disappearance of Gaddafi may on the one hand be just reflective what you see in the Arab world, or perhaps reflective of a larger global trend whereby as we move into a more transparent universe where all leaders are on display 24 hours a day, the capacity of building myths around great leaders is disappearing. I mean, we all laugh at Berlusconi and what he's doing. But remember another great leader, John F. Kennedy. If he was living today, you would get the same sort of stories about him, and the myth of John F. Kennedy would disappear. And so even if you compare with 20 years ago when we had Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Chancellor Kohl, President Mitterrand, you had strong leaders because you lived in a zeitgeist where the myth of a strong leader was still there. But today, with so much transparency, we see the weaknesses of all our leaders so clearly, and we cannot build up the myth of great leaders. So as I explained with the first historical juncture, this is the time when we need more and more, when the demand for global leadership is growing, and because of the third historical juncture, the supply is diminishing. So as a result of these three historical junctures, we should not be surprised that we feel this enormous anxiety and angst about the future. So why then do I feel so optimistic about the future? I feel optimistic because the world has now, I would say, reached agreement on what I call three new global consensus. Now, I'm not sure what the plural of consensus is, whether it's consensi or consensuses, but three global consensus. And each one of them is transforming our world profoundly at a speed we have never before seen in human history. And what are these three consensus? The consensus number one is what I call the modernization consensus. And the modernization consensus explains why billions of people all over the world, especially in Asia, are being rescued from poverty, and the march to modernity is sweeping throughout Asia. Let me just give you one statistic. Today, there are 500 million people living in the middle class of Asia. By 2020, 9 years from now, that figure is going to grow to 1.75 billion people. And by 2030, possibly 3 to 4 billion people in Asia. Imagine that. A world with 3 billion middle-class Asians sharing the same dreams and hopes and aspirations and wanting the world to remain stable and peaceful. And that world is coming. And I can tell you another piece of good news, especially for those of you who live in the West, who worry every day about what's happening to the Islamic world. You worry, will the Islamic world transform itself? And the good news I have for you is that this march to modernity that is sweeping across Asia is now poised to enter West Asia and North Africa. And when it does, you will see the transformation over there. And the reason why Asian modernization can transform the Islamic world is because in the past, when the Islamic world, like modernization, they said modernization equals westernization. They wanted modernization, they didn't want westernization. Now they look at Asian modernization, they say, hey, I can modernize and I don't have to westernize. And that creates a whole new opportunities that's going to transform that world. So the modernization consensus is going to make the world a better place. And what's the second? The second consensus is the peace consensus. And here I'm absolutely shocked that nobody mentions that if you look at the number of people dying in interstate wars, it's the lowest it's ever been. People don't die in interstate wars anymore. Why? Because governments around the world, no matter where you are, in Asia or Africa or Europe, are beginning to learn that war is futile. And this is where the biggest gift of Europe to the world has been that you have shown the world that between major countries like France, Germany, UK, you don't just have zero wars, you have zero prospect of war. And that's the shining light of Europe that is going to travel through the world to develop the consensus of peace.